Hello, and thank you for joining Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. My name is Ashley Burrell. I'm the Secretary of the Board for Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. We will be producing monthly podcasts featuring women of color in the peace and security field, so please visit WCAPS.org regularly for more details.
Welcome to another podcast for WCAPS. My name is Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. I am the president and founder of WCAPS, and we're happy to be here to have a conversation with one of the advisors to our advisory council for WCAPS, Laila Hasan. Some of you may already know from our tweeting and from our Instagram, and also from the page on WCAPS. Laila is the March Women of the Month for WCAPS, so it's really a great honor to have a chance to talk with her and to share some of her thoughts about being a woman of color in the areas of peace and security. And Laila actually is moving on. She's at State Department right now, Foreign Service Officer, which is wonderful, and she's going to be moving on to a great assignment, but I'll let you tell that story, Laila. So I'd like to turn over to Laila to introduce herself, to say a little bit about where she is and what she's doing. So Laila, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jenkins, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today, for the invitation, and for the great opportunity to be on the Advisory Council for WCAPS. It really is a pleasure to work with such a wonderful organization. As you mentioned, I am a Foreign Service Officer with the State Department. I've been there for about 8 years. I'm currently working in our Operations Center based here in Washington, and where we support the Secretary for a variety of engagements and diplomacy and other seventh floor principles as well. And then this fall, I will be taking my next assignment at our embassy in Paris, where I'll be working in the political section on Middle East and Muslim engagement issues across France.
That's great, Laila, and I'm totally envious that you'll be going to Paris for a while. Such a great assignment.
I'm definitely looking forward to it.
Congratulations on getting that
assignment. Thank you. Thank you.
So tell us a little about your background and where you're from.
Sure. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona. For the most part, I was born in the UK actually, and moved to the States when I was about 3. My dad was working overseas, and so then we came back to the States and moved around quite a bit when I was younger for his work in Minnesota and Washington State, and then we wound up in Tucson when I was about 9. So I do consider Tucson to be my hometown. But then I moved to DC when I was 18 to start school at George Washington University here in DC, and have pretty much been here ever since. So I won't say quite how long, but it's definitely, the time has flown by. After graduation, I started working for the Defense Department. I was there for about 5 years as an Arabic and Middle East analyst, and worked in mostly counterterrorism issues. And then I joined the State Department in 2010. My first assignment, a fantastic assignment in Beirut, as our embassy in Lebanon. And then I moved on to Brussels after that, working at our bilateral embassy to the Kingdom of Belgium. And then came back to DC, working in our Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, where I covered our countering violent extremism policy and programs for Europe, and then started this assignment in the Operations Center just last year.
Great. So what made you interested in the field of foreign service?
Well, actually, I started when I was quite young, in middle school, when I saw Secretary Albright become the first female Secretary of State. I was totally in awe. I thought that was just the coolest job, to be able to travel the world and meet new people and learn different languages. And of course, as I got older, I learned that it was a little bit more of a nuanced profession than what I had first thought, but it definitely sparked my interest, seeing her engage with world leaders. And I was fortunate when I was growing up also to have the opportunity to do quite a bit of traveling, and I have a lot of family overseas, and so we would visit them quite a bit, in Egypt in particular, an uncle working in the World Health Organization in Alexandria, so we would visit them quite a few times when I was young. And so that just sparked a real interest in, again, engaging with other cultures and travel, learning about the world around me.
Great. And so what is your favorite aspect about what you're doing now at State?
I think right now, I mean, it really is a people-to-people diplomacy. I think the human interaction and engagement is one of the most rewarding and satisfying opportunities. And it's a real privilege to have a job, to have a career where your responsibility is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I know that can sound a little bit cliche, but it's something that I am incredibly proud of to do on a daily basis. And we are at the front lines of foreign policy making and implementation, and it's just a real thrill to be a part of it.
Great. And it is certainly a rewarding career. I also spent many years in working for the federal government in different parts in both Department of Defense and State Department. So, and I'm very, very happy with my years working for the government. Very rewarding. So what do you think how does the integration of diverse voices, like voices of women of color, how do you feel that that impacts foreign policy, peace and security policies?
Sure. I think it's definitely it's a very important aspect. We need to have diverse voices, not just at the table, but making decisions as well. We need to have an integrated, diverse workforce, leadership, all through the ranks. There needs to be diversity represented, and it's not just diversity in race; it's diversity in geography, it's diversity in educational background, it's diversity. You need to have both genders represented. There really needs to be a wide spectrum at the negotiating table, at the leadership levels, because if you do not have a wide range of perspectives represented, not everyone is represented, and it's not, better decisions are made when you have a broad spectrum of voices and opinions and perspectives involved.
And when you say better decisions, how do you define that? How would you
Well,
explain?
I think that it's just a broader perspective. It's a broader, everybody has their own vantage points. Everybody has their own personal experiences, and yes, biases. And I think that when you have a broader table, a more inclusive table, then decisions are more fulsome. You are able to learn from one another. You're able to think of things that you might not have thought of yourself. So by better decision, I think it just means I think more nuanced, a little more inclusive, and that will have that take into account a wider audience.
And since I know in the area that you're working in the State Department, so many of our policies have impact overseas, and our policies are also meant to shape how we are perceived and our programs. So having these diverse voices, often from people who are, let's say, the diaspora, or who have that
Sure.
perspective. I mean, how does that, you think, say that a little bit about that and our policies, which are to impact the world and the global community?
Absolutely. I think it's definitely, when we're in the Foreign Service, for example, in the State Department, the U.S. government, we are, of course, representing the United States. We are Americans, and we are promoting national interests around the world, and we are promoting our values, our democratic values, importance of human rights, religious freedom. I can go on and on. When you have a diverse workforce, perhaps from different backgrounds. For myself, for example, my father's from Pakistan, immigrated to the U.S. I have family in Egypt, as I said, and Saudi Arabia, so across the Middle East. My dad's side is Muslim, my mom's side is Christian. I have a very a unique perspective when it comes to some of these issues. And when we all bring our own stories, our own backgrounds to the table. And when you're talking, as you mentioned, about diaspora communities, or when you're influencing different programs around the world, you're able to provide cultural context. You're able to provide a different nuance, a different angle, that maybe somebody who isn't as familiar with the region doesn't have a personal perspective on that might not be able to offer that. And that's not to say that somebody who has worked and traveled and studied a particular region, can't speak to those issues as well. It's not, what I'm saying. It's more that you're able to have a broad and deeper experience and commentary when it is an area that your heritage, your origins might come from.
That's great. And what would you say are some of the challenges for women, particularly women of color, in the areas of peace, security, and conflict, and in
Sure.
terms of the jobs or other things like that? What do you think are the unique challenges that are faced?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is underrepresentation. This has traditionally been a male-dominated field. I've spent most of my career working in some aspect of counterterrorism and counter-violent extremism, and traditionally, that is something that usually a lot of men around the table. I have been in more meetings than I can count, as the only woman at the table, and let alone as a woman of color. That is usually a very underrepresented group, if represented at all. So I think that's definitely one of the biggest challenges, and it's getting better. I think that is definitely something we are seeing slowly, a more diverse workforce, and then slowly through the leadership and senior ranks. It's still something that we are working to improve, and I hope, through the next generation or so, that this will no longer be such a conversation, that it will not be such an issue that, or a remarkable thing to have a woman of color at the table working on national security issues.
And that's an excellent point, because so many of the policies, particularly in areas of peace and security and conflict, impact women most directly in a lot of countries. And so, as you said, having women
Absolutely.
able to give a perspective on how some of those policies may impact women, particularly women of color in some of these countries, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, it's very important to at least have that perspective, as you're saying, at the table, because that's, it will be impacting them very directly.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned that, you think it's gotten better, and to some degree, for women in the area. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean,
in these fields.
Absolutely, and we have some very strong examples. I'll just speak, for example, in diplomacy, and we had 3 female secretaries of state, and we've had 2 secretaries of color. We have, Secretary Condoleezza Rice as a woman of color as our Secretary of State. We have a lot of female ambassadors and leaders within the State Department. So that is, we're getting there. And I would say we're very good at bringing in a very diverse workforce. We have some great fellowships at the State Department, the Rangel Fellowship in particular, which helps recruit and bring in a more diverse cohort into the State Department. We're still across the board struggling, so it seems, with some of our numbers in the more senior ranks across the board, and having a diverse leadership. However, that's something I think, as I was saying before, with the next generation, hopefully will become less and less of an issue. And now that those of us who are at the table myself included, it's incumbent upon us to really recruit and ensure that diplomacy in these fields of national security, peace and security are open and welcoming and encouraging for women of color to get involved in and stay involved in.
And you made an excellent point about the advancement issue. And what do you either what do you think some of the challenges are for advancement for women of color, women and women of color, and what do you think might improve that situation? Because it's not just State Department; there's other departments and
Sure.
places that have the same challenge.
Yeah, I can't put a finger on exactly what the root cause of this is. I know it's a discussion that is currently very active, not just in the State Department, as you mentioned, across the U.S. government and probably within NGOs in the private sector as well. I think one thing that's just very important is that we continue to identify and recruit leaders from within communities of color, looking at women of color, and that there are more than plenty of qualified women who should be at the table who are not, and that we're not reaching out to. And I think that's something that we need to be better at doing, is continuing the recruitment, and also in the we have very different selection panels and the assignments process. We need to make sure it's as inclusive as possible. I know we've had some discussions recently regarding some of our more hardship assignments in terms of whether or not we have good representation or equal representation of women and women of color within the leadership ranks, and unfortunately we don't always see that enough numbers of them. So that's something that needs to be worked on. And I think something we've seen at State Department for women, regardless of ethnic background, sometimes there's a self-selection of not pursuing some jobs, whether it requires them to be away from their families on unaccompanied assignments. For example, that's sometimes those positions can be more male-dominated. Not always, but there are a lot of different aspects that we need to take a look at to find out how we can improve the recruitment and retention process.
And so what would you say to a young woman of color who is interested or just entering the field of foreign policy, peace, security, and conflict? What would be your advice to them in terms of the challenges that they may face and how to overcome those challenges?
Sure. I think the most important thing, and what I would probably tell my younger self, is that you have a unique perspective, a unique voice, and don't be afraid to use it. You have every right to be sitting at the table, that you should be speaking up and speaking out and contributing just as much as the rest of your colleagues. And so I think that for me, it was kind of an initial fear. Am I qualified enough? When you're looking around the room, there's nobody here that necessarily looks like me, comes from a background similar to mine. That can be very intimidating. And I think I would just want to reiterate that, to keep pushing forward, that, you belong at the table just as much as anyone else. And it's, we need to hear everyone's voice.
And who've been some of your role models? I mean, how have you found the way to keep yourself motivated at times where you're the only person of color or the other woman or the only woman of color in a room, and
Sure.
That you have just as much to offer, but it is a bit intimidating. I mean, what have been your mechanisms for dealing with those situations?
Sure. I think one of my biggest role models, and I mentioned her before, was Secretary Albright. And I remember when she was at the UN as our ambassador to the United Nations, she had a kind of a club of women other female ambassadors to the UN, and she would make a point of, always taking their phone calls and empowering the other female ambassadors, realizing that they were a small number, but they needed to support each other and be there together. And I think something that I've at least tried to do is to seek out other women, look for role models, and then sometimes if there isn't anybody in the room, you just kind of have to take a deep breath and chin up and go forward. It's not always easy, but I try to think of the women and men who have come before me, who have helped make it possible for me to be in that room, and that hopefully my presence will make it easier for someone else down the road.
Great. And these are great answers. Thank you. So looking at WCAPS and what you know about the organization, and again, thanks for, serving on our advisory council. How do you think the organization can advance women of color's voice on critical issues of peace, security, and conflict transformation?
Well, I think what you're doing right now is one of the most important things that can be done, and that's amplifying the voices of women who are already in the field. There are amazing women across the sector who are doing just incredible work, and I think those voices and those experiences aren't highlighted enough. And so by getting their voices out, getting their stories out, is such a motivating factor for the next generation of women. And as we've talked about, representation really matters, and being able to see what women are already achieving will only inspire the next generation to do even more.
Great. And how do you think WCAPS can continue to engage the next generation? What are some of your thoughts? I mean, we have the Young Ambassadors Program, which you are aware of, but
yes.
Are there other thoughts for how to engage? I mean, you've been very helpful, for example, to get us engaged with the folks at State Department. Other ideas like that come to mind at all?
Sure. I think it's very important to engage on college campuses and young professionals who are already in the field. And just a step beyond that would be, I think, to be reaching out to high schoolers, looking at young kids who are thinking about the different options and opportunities, and getting them to think about a possible career in peace and security when they think that might not be possible. When kids are already in college, that's amazing. We can help guide them into different directions, but also motivating kids who might not even be thinking about college options or career options, and sparking that interest when they're young, I think is really critical.
That's really great to hear, because those are some of the things that that WCAPS is going to be doing, is reaching out not just to universities and colleges, but also to the high schoolers, because we understand the need for the strengthen the pipeline, and to start early in terms of reaching out to young women, to encourage them to be bold and to feel confident, and to empower them to get into this field, but whatever field they want to get into.
Absolutely.
That's a great comment, so thank you for that one. I think we'll just end with maybe if you have any final thoughts on this issue of women of color in peace, security, and conflict, the challenges, the need to have a support system and to work together when those moments are, when it gets difficult. Any other thoughts on those points, final thoughts?
I do. I have one little anecdote, if you'll permit me to share, that I think kind of, for me, just encapsulates, as you were saying, when I'm having a tough day, or really trying to get through some of these challenges. I think maybe women in particular sometimes underestimate and undervalue their importance of being at the table and their experiences, and realizing the impact that their stories can have on the communities around them. And when I was serving in Brussels, one of the portfolios that I worked on was engagement with the Muslim community and counteracting some of the Islamophobia that they were experiencing in Belgium, and I was sitting at a table there as an embassy representative, but with a lot of Belgian youth, and they were third generation. They were Muslim, most of them from Moroccan origin, but they're Belgian citizens, born and raised in the country. And one of their youth leaders, turned to me and said, "You were such an example and for these kids." And I kind of looked at him, and it didn't really, I never really thought of myself as too much of a role model. I was there, passionate about my work and doing my job. But he said, no, he's like, these kids are able to look at you. You are the daughter of a Muslim immigrant to the United States, and you are now sitting here as a U.S. diplomat speaking to these children, and you're giving them the opportunity, just the mere existence as the daughter of a Muslim immigrant. They're able to dare to imagine a different future for themselves. It's not something that they might naturally think that they could achieve in Belgium. And so just by being there, you're inspiring them to dream of something different for themselves as they continue the pursuit of social integration and religious freedom. And that really stuck with me, that, just by speaking up, just by being there, by being at the table, you can be, a motivating factor for somebody else. And that's one of the most rewarding things I can think of, and why I think so many of us pursue a career in public service.
Well, Laila, that's a great way to end it, because you are definitely a role model, and I think it's important, like you said, for people to never underestimate, not only what a role model they are, but that there are people who are looking at you, and younger women who will see the fact that there's other women, particularly for young women of color, there's other women of color out there doing really good things. And that in itself, even if they never say hi to you, or you may not even know they're doing it and that they're there, it's very important.
Exactly.
The role that you're playing. So that's a really good way to end with a really good final thought. So thank you again,
Well, thank
Laila,
you
for taking the time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, it's great, and it's wonderful to have your thoughts. And again, thank you for the time you dedicate to the organization, and for being on the advisory council. And we will certainly be in touch, and wish you well with your travel and your work in Paris. As I said,
thank you very much.
Wonderful way to go, a wonderful way to advance and move on with your career at the State Department. So, and thanks, of course,
thank you very much.
for doing as our public servant.
I look forward to continuing working with WCAPS and with you, Ambassador. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. So that's this concludes another podcast for our WCAPS podcast series. I want to thank you for listening and for being a part of the WCAPS work and our mission. And we will see you at our next podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining Women of Color, Advancing Peace and Security. Please visit WCAPS.org. That's WCAPS.org.